Guy Sengstock, welcome to Radio Wolf. I'm really happy to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's such a privilege. It's always a privilege getting to talk with you. It's funny the moment your face appeared on my screen, like within seconds we got into, the depth of the ontological meaning of life, right?
That's true. I have to say it happened to me. Maybe was it 5 or 10 years ago? All of a sudden, I heard from different people this word circling,
Hmm.
and people were very intrigued by. And at that time already, we did our own form of dialogue and was kind of curious. And people just got very inspired. And I remember there was one of these integral conferences, European Integral Conference in Hungary, where half of the conference was really very taken by some people doing circling work there. And then I
Yeah.
started to look a bit like, so who is doing the circling work and what is this about? And um, I found it very intriguing how it brings something to people's life where they feel met in a way that is very meaningful to them.
Yeah.
And may I ask you, as you basically you started all this in some way,
Mhm.
circling. I mean, now it has its own life, I understand, and it
Yeah.
has different life forms. But you
Yeah.
started circling as a dialogue form. How how did it come about? What wasn't the beginning of doing circling?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because it's my relationship to how it came about keeps showing itself to me. I notice, like, I've often talked about, when people ask me this question, is like I could look at it in terms of like the sequence of historical events that happened,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the I'm coming to understand in my relationship to the history or the origins of this is, I keep feeling like it's being shown to me,
Mm-hmm.
because then, like, one level, circling was in some sense is something that we stumbled across, right? I mean, and I think that's really important to kind of understand about circling is the whole thing really was an emergent co-collaborative emergent discovery, if you will. And it was back in 1998. I had that time I had moved to San Francisco to go to art school. I'm I I became really good friends with a man by the name of Jerry Candelaria and a lot of his community. And and my kind of background coming into that, like you could say that the kind of a lot of the conversation that I was coming from was a, was around um, being a lot around AA and 12 step kind
Mm-hmm.
of when I was a kid, because my parents got sober when I was 12. And, I would say a big influence on me was just starting to be around wise people. Right? There's like a lot of wise people. You get a group of people that basically, you know, um, basically for all intents and purposes died and come back, right, over and over again. Um, and so being around those people and being around people that were living out and enacting a deeper conversation, um, was something in some sense I grew up in from say age 12. Uh, and so I was really, when I by the time I'm by the time I was, like, in my early 20s, I was pretty immersed, right, in a deeper conversation, right? And specifically the because AA is all about sharing, right? It's the whole thing is about being together and having a community and being honest and having deeper conversations. and and so in some sense, I felt deeply impacted by those conversations and by those people. Now, when I moved to San Francisco, I started to meet people that were having even deeper conversations, but also did hallucinogenics, right? Also did all these kind of, landmark education, and San Francisco is like the heart of the human potential movement, and so my interface with that was really Jerry Candelarian, meeting him, and in that relationship, I kind of, in some sense, introduced him to my world, right? My angle on things. And he deeply, introduced me to his whole world, right? Of psychedelics and breath work and all of these evocative, like really intense emotional, transformational dialogues that had a link to where I was coming from, but took it to a completely different level. And we essentially were at Burning Man in 1998, and with the people that we were hanging out with, there was like a conflict one night, and essentially, for all intents and purposes, we ended up in this kind of strange art teepee thing out in the middle of the desert of the playa in Burning Man, and Jerry and I just brought our attention on the conflict. And essentially, the way that Jerry and I spontaneously started to relate or respond to it, took the conversation where it dropped, we went from the level of the conflict down to a much deeper level. And we had this experience of where the attention went on one of the people, and everyone had this profound experience of the deepest part of this person coming into revelation in all of our listening, if you will. This profound experience of, right, through that conflict, opening up to this person being deeply seen, and in some sense, this experience of the people who witnessed it, bear witness to that person, was deeply kind of transformative for the listener too. And then it just naturally rolled over to the next person, and something very similar happened with that person and then the next person. And it was kind of this something like 12 hours where time disappeared, right? And when we were walking away from that experience, and by this time it's like, it's morning, the sun came up, we stayed up all night. It was one of those kinds of things. And Jerry and I were walking away from that, and we both spontaneously kind of turned to each other, and he pointed back to where we were sitting, and I pointed back to where we were sitting, and we were like, we didn't have a word for what that experience was, but there was this shared recognition that whatever that was a deep, profound experience that was somehow distinct from all the other deep, profound experiences that we were engaged in at that time. And we just spontaneously looked at each other and brought our hands out and committed to it. Wow. And it's so interesting because on some level, I feel like for me, at a very deep level, circling for me has been the process of discovering what opened up that night, what that was. And I'm still, I would say my relationship to circling is I'm still finding out what that was, and the horizon that opened up and all the things that are connected to that. It keeps being something that it's like a horizon that just keeps yielding more and more. There's something inexhaustible about what I think circling touches in on. And I would say out of that handshake gathered, people communities, organizations came out of that. We started teaching courses. And, so that's kind of and then it started to go all over the world, right? Within about 10 years, there was people were doing circling in Europe and, Russia and Australia. And, now it's really kind of, it's practically everywhere. And in watching that spreading, right, and how it spread, what I didn't realize at the time, right, and that I'm now realizing, and it took a while for me to kind of understand a bit about what exactly was going on with circling and why did it spread so much, right? So, for example, like you talked about, you started hearing about circling, and people have this deeply moving experience that really, opened something up for them in a profound way, right? But my question was like, what is it about it that had it spread so much? And what I didn't understand at the time was, it's 1998 in the Bay Area, and we're right at the beginnings, right, essentially of the .com movement of the internet. And what I didn't realize is that in some sense, I think what we were responding to was a future that was just starting to come into articulation, which I think something really profound happened, right, with the structure of communication with the advent of the internet. And I think basically what we saw is kind of for the first time in history, we uncoupled, right, information exchange between two people from relationship, right? Because, say before the answering machine, if you wanted to exchange information with somebody, you at least had to talk to them on the phone, right? There was also, of course, there's a printing press, and there's ways that you can get one-way communication without relationship, but two-way, synergistic, this back and forth contact, living contact with another human being got uncoupled, right? So in other words, we could connect, and asynchronously connect, right, without having to relate. And I think the impact of that, I don't think that we totally understand, right, or even recognize, right, what the impact of that is on us or will be. And so circling happened to be a yoga on a very concentrated and intense yoga or meditation on direct contact. And basically, one of the ways that you can look at circling is it's like something like, if you took the fundamental unit of all relation, right, as something like an I thou, and you just made that a yoga or a practice or a series of asanas, right, or exercises, and you just dove deep into those asanas and practices, that's essentially what circling is. And I think one of the things that was being called on, or circling was a response to, was the very beginnings, right, of this loss of synchronistic connection. And because just like anything, it's like the moment, like our nervous systems are it's just gonna naturally move towards the path of least resistance. And relationship is just inherently messy. If you look at all the things that can happen in a conversation, positively and negatively, I mean, it's filled with ambiguity. It's filled with coordination. It's like relationship is the very way that we become individuals, right? Is in and through subjectivity. And if I have a choice between having to go through that and just sending a text, right, or all the other multiple ways that we have this ability to connect, right, without having to relate, our nervous systems are naturally just going to drift towards that. And so circling happened to be in some sense, a yoga of that very thing that became optional for the first time, I think, in our history. And so now when I think about the origin of circling, I'm starting to understand that's starting to occur to me as more what the real history was, right? Is a kind of anticipation and response to this big shift, right, in the structure of communication and structure of relationship.
The two things really standing out in listening what you're saying. There's on one hand this one moment in this tent in this desert in Nevada, Burning Man, and the two of you pointing back, and you kind of said it's something opened up that night in that tent, and I'm really curious what opened up that night.
Yep.
And on the other hand, you were describing the moment in history, basically the invention of the World Wide Web, the explosion of the World Wide Web, that's more accurate to say. That kind of changed something in the human communication structure, which is the kind of the divide of maybe dialogue on one hand and information on the other hand, because all of a sudden there were all these other means to change information, which the way I hear you opened up something different, new, how people can be with each other. How do these two parts come together?
Yeah.
What opened up that night? How does this relate to this moment in history?
Yeah, totally. Exactly. And I would say, I would say something like, well, I mean, if you look at it, if you look at another historical kind of something similar to that, if we look at it in terms of like say the Industrial Revolution, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things the Industrial Revolution did is machines kind of afforded like basically brought our life into a small circle in front of us. So we didn't have to move as much. It uncoupled, right? Like, I don't know, execution or functionality from movement, right? So machines, we for the first time, we didn't have to move. Whereas before the Industrial Revolution, if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to dig a hole, right? There was a deep coupling between functioning and exercising, essentially. And it was a necessity. So when the Industrial Revolution and machines kind of uncoupled, right, movement from functioning, all of a sudden that radically changed our understanding and our relationship with our bodies, right? Because of course we all know it's like, well, people started, they started dawning on them that there's this thing called physical fitness, and people started to gain weight and they started having all these kind of issues, and therefore we had to actually take up our bodies in a radically different way, and take it up deliberately and consciously. And now we have these strange things called gyms, which you pay money to, they kind of, you concentrate gravity into these rooms and you pay money to go in there and move, right, in order to exercise. So that's a huge transformation of our understanding of our body, and having to take that on. And we're still dealing with that. So in a very similar way, there's this uncoupling from, in order to, you could say the uncoupling of connecting from a relationship, right? Now there's not, life doesn't demand as much connection or as much relationship as it used to. It doesn't have as much necessity as it used to have. In fact, it's so strange when you think about it, because it's like the first time in history where it's like literally possible, if somebody has an internet connection, they could start a company, they could become wealthy, they could become famous, they can have all kinds of like billions of connections without ever having to like actually relate to anybody. And it's such a it's such a strange thing. And so I think if you think though about what goes on with intersubjectivity and in contact with other human beings, right? Even the most simplest conversation involves so much of our neurology, right? Of our identity. We're exercising so many things and coordinating so many things in the most simplest, right? In the moment exchange between two people. There's so much going on there. And those very connections, if you think about it, is how we become people, right? We become in and through the relation. I see it. We just had my computer dropped off, so apologize for the interruption. Yeah, so I think what we're talking about essentially is, you know, in some sense, you know, how we become people. It's fun. It's, you know, I have my second son was born 16 months ago, so I'm every second of every day I'm reminded of how deeply we human beings are fundamentally relational all the way down, right? It's like it's like more than any other organism that we know about, right? And if you think about how deeply vulnerable the human infant is, I don't know if there's anything that's more helpless or vulnerable or dependent, right, on its environment, right, than the human infant. And what's a mind-boggling paradox to me is that when you consider that, right, that we start off fundamentally helpless and dependent and vulnerable, yet who are the ones who are like looking to go to Mars, right? Who are the ones who are on top of the food chain, right? Mm-hmm. There seems to be this deep connection between what I like to call like our vulnerability and our ability, and that difference that makes that difference that affords that vulnerability to open up to the universe and to be everything that human beings are has to do with how deeply we were seen when we were kids, how deeply we were held in the holding environment and the attunement. It's like relationship, right, is literally how we become who we are. And I think that continues our whole life. And so if you eliminate, you know, if you think about this, if you eliminate those connections, right, and make them optional, right, and they stop becoming, life doesn't inherently necessitate those kinds of connections. Mm-hmm. I mean, the implications of that are just huge. And so in some sense, circling, right, as we practice, in some sense, I think is a response to that happening. And I think it's one of the main reasons is it's the growth of circling says a lot about circling, but I think it also discloses a lot about our time. And that's what I mean by it's kind of strange, because if I look at the history of circling, I keep feeling like I'm learning more about the history, right, as it goes forward. And so circling as its practice is essentially, you could look at circling as something like a good way of thinking about it for those people who have not experienced it is if you took all of the deeply impactful conversations in your life, right? Like conversations where you had a profound insight, right? Or like conversations where you had like a profound sense of intimacy and connection. And you just looked at all those conversations in your life that like were transformative to you or deeply developmental. And you took all those conversations and those relationships and you kind of like found the through line, right? Through all of them. And you took that through line and then you formed a practice, right? Where you made you made basically turned it into asanas, right? So like asanas are postures, right, of communication, of speaking, of listening, asanas of ways of being, of attention, all the things, all the different things that go into profound interactions, right, and transformative conversations. And you were to make that, right, a set of postures or a series of asanas, right, as a practice. Circling is something like getting together with a group of people and going deeply into those poses, going deeply into those asanas of of profound listening and right, profoundly letting go, and you know, profound the ability to deeply like access your experience and disclose it to the other person. All the things that happen with deep connections and intimacy, and you practice that. In
Let
some
me
sense, I would say yes, yes.
let me use the comparison with the asanas that you're using, because everybody who did some yoga has some awareness that the asanas that you're doing in different forms of yoga have a relationship to something that in the Indian context is called prana. It's opening up prana, and all the sequencing of doing it is all kind of liberating, opening up, enlivening prana. The asanas of circling, what are they directed towards?
I would say that's a great question. My first stab at it would be something like it's opening us up to the, you know, you could say the transformative possibility of relationship, of connection. I'd say that, yeah, that in some sense it's all of those possibilities, like all of those asanas, right, make sense because something's possible, right, that it's in response to, right. And I think it's this way how relationships and conversations, you know, can be these things that can be experiences that are deeply transformative, are deeply developmental, right? Psychologically, spiritually, ontologically, right? In all these ways, there's ways where like relationships can have this element that can be deeply self-disclosive of who I am and who you are at levels that go beyond us. And I would say that circling, in some sense, are those asanas are really abiding in response to that possibility in relationship. Yeah.
Let me ask it in this way. It's something that kind of always, when I talk to you, comes to me as a possibility of what circling is really about. And you mentioned it several times in this conversation, also when you talked about being seen, the vulnerability of a baby. Is this something about the transformative power of really being seen? There's something where you are in the presence of someone who really sees you and reflects back to you, being seen, that does something to you, who you are, that liberates something and transforms something. Is this kind of the alchemy? It's opening up, and that is maybe the form that use the wording I started to use, that is opening up the prana in the form of relationship, where
absolutely.
something is opening up in the relationship because being seen liberates me from false layers of myself and forces me. I mean, my guess is also that it's not necessarily always just a positive ecstatic feeling. It can be also frightening, whatever. It's just being seen.
Totally.
And in this confrontation of being naked, there's space for truth, for reality to open up.
Yeah, absolutely. And that space for truth and reality open up is where, in my experience with circling, right, that space for truth and reality to open up, that's the possibility. That's what I think circling is tuned into. And I think you rightly are intuiting in the right direction when you talk about this experience of being deeply seen, right? It can be such a profound experience, right? On so many ways. It can be profoundly difficult. It can be profoundly enlightening, the whole range of things, the way that you can experience that. But there's something about us, and these things, we're talking about, these things are deeply mysterious, right? This way, but there's something about being seen and recognized, not just for what I already understand about myself, right? But that I'm seen and recognized beyond what I can see and understand about myself, right? That level of disclosure, I think on one level, what that gives, right, is this, I'm this person walking around, and I now have more access to myself, right? There's that level. But there's the experience of these kind of deep revelatory recognitions, right? Also, I don't know how to put this, is really tricky and try to put this into words, but also it also gives me this experience that there are, in fact, I am a being that is in fact deeper than I could comprehend. And having just that sense of opening up to the depth of that I am, you could say, the source of myself is something like, as John Vervaeke would say, is like, we're something like a fount of inexhaustible intelligibility, right? There's the deep moreness. And so in a very personal way, when people, I think, have these experiences of personally having insights, right, about themselves, and other people sharing that with each other, and that being seen, on one level, it's about the content of that insight, but I would say in a deeper level, it reveals a deeper truth about our ontological being that we are. So in that sense, it becomes like I think a deeply spiritual practice for a lot of people.
That's interesting that you're saying that, because somehow I connect this also with what you described about the separation of communication with the birth of the World Wide Web in that, where meeting like this, to some degree, get also freed of the necessity for transactional meetings. There's something where, because the transactional is more and more with email, WhatsApp, all this transactional sphere is concentrated there. So there's some space for something different.
Yeah.
In these meetings that you are allowing to happen with circling, when we are with each other, somehow, not completely, but somehow freed of the necessity of transactional relating, there's a different relating opening up. Where on one hand, you are describing it beautiful. There's also, in that sense, information. There's something opening up content-wise that's different for me. But just the fact that I'm different with you, not transaction-oriented,
yes,
changes the dynamics, because it is not about transactions anymore, and something as there's something different opening up, because it is about witnessing and opening, and there's a mystery that rightfully has this spiritual dimension that you are touching on here.
Totally. And I think that the opening up of those deep horizons, right? Mm-hmm. And because relationship is so in the moment, it's so experiential, it's so real, right? It's something that we're concretely experiencing in real time, in the moment with each other. To find oneself with being basically kind of opening up, right, is so, it's got a reality to it that is I think just registers is in something like realizing that reality wasn't, it was more than I even could ever have imagined, right? Mm-hmm. Like reality as such starts to become opened up through this way of interacting with each other, right? That, as you say, that whole world becomes opened up. And and that's where I think, as you were talking about earlier, where a number of years ago you started to hear people talk about this thing about circling and about this way that they were deeply impacted by it. I think that's one way of maybe understanding, right, what they were talking about is like, it's like a horizon opened up that once once that horizon opens up, that changes kind of how everything occurs on some level. Mm-hmm. And now I think there's the element of encircling that's about being circled, right, and being seen. But here's the other thing. It's also the other side of that, which is about seeing, right? It's about, and I would say that in my experience, that when people really take on the practice, one of the deep reasons that they're taking it on was what's speaking to them, right? What they want and what they experience is not just being seen, but having this ability, right, to, in relationship with you, is to see you mm-hmm. in this profound way, mm-hmm. right?
Isn't it also just the capacity to see in a different way?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Because something else came also to my mind when you, again, connecting it with this bigger time, moment in time.
Yeah.
It's, on one hand, one could say that we are freed off to this technical sphere, to something different, but on the other hand, we are more and more basically inframed in this technical sphere. As I know, you have a relationship to Heidegger, basically that we become part of the Gestell.
Yep.
In a way that there's also a longing to step out of this instrumentalization and technical instrumental relationship of everything, or you could also call it the commodifying of everything, including relationships. So that as something like 20 or 30 years ago, something happened culturally profoundly significant in Western culture, which is the birth of the meditation, mindfulness, in a way which didn't have place in Western culture. There's something where there was a necessity to stop, to stop and just be, which created this mindfulness revolution that we are somehow still in. And I could see that what you're describing and the asanas that you have been developing and that have been developed around circling are kind of asanas to bring this mindfulness, that's the opposite of technical and instrumental relationship, into relationship, not just sitting there, but being with each other and opening and even using language. With this other eyes and this other seeing and this other seeing the other, which again opens the mystery, and it's the opposite of the technical world.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Yes. And the world of, as Martin Buber would talk about, the world of I, thou.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And it's funny because it's as Buber talked about, there's like, we are essentially existentially always already a relationship. And we're in his terminology, he talks about we're either in an I it or an I thou.
Mm-hmm.
And he emphasizes this over and over and over again, where he talks about, and I it is spoken as one word, and I thou is spoken as one word.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you can kind of feel this sense where it's for many people, there's some people that have never ever actually had a non-transactional relationship. Right. There's some people that just they don't even know that they haven't experienced it. Right.
Right.
And when they start to get this sense of like where you stop being, I'm relating to you not as an end, or not as a means to my own ends, but as an end in yourself. The more I can the more I can start to have this experience of you as a thou, you can feel a different I, right, that co-arises with that sense of you as a thou, right? They're spoken as one word. And I think that's one of the things that's so compelling for people, is the sense in deeply seeing you, right? There's as you open up in your kind of like inexhaustibility, and I start to have a real relationship with you in that way, there's in as I do that, there's a corresponding I that I become, right, in relationship to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience of having access to a completely whole other, like, different dimensional existential experience of the world, right? That's the horizon that opens up. And I think that people get a taste of that, and that becomes it sets a precedence in a certain sense of what's possible. And I think about recently, a friend of mine has been talking about, we've been in discussion about this together. He's been going deeply into I think the way the Christian mystics talk about this is the eye of charity, right? And that in the last month or so has really kind of caught my attention, because I think there's something really deep going on there that kind of gets at a bit of what we're talking about, right? In terms of this learning how to see, right? My understanding of the eye of charity is something like it's developing an eye, right? That's able to see, something like the ultimate good, right? Beyond appearance. And that as you develop that eye that can see the good, right? Like in and through and beyond appearance, that your relationship you can cultivate a relationship to that can become so deep that um that being able to see the good, that there's a corresponding self-emptying, right? That is a kind of room making, right?
Mm-hmm.
For that which shines through things, right? And that it's symbolically like that's I think expressing Christianity of, like, for example, the relationship to the poor, and the meek, and all of that symbolic, talk about, like, where um the most in its presentation, the most gnarly, you know difficult, concealed forms of appearance of reality, that it's possible someone who has cultivated the eye of charity that can actually be attuned to the good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then therefore their relationship to what's in front of them and what appears, right, becomes much more profound and a kind of self-emptying. And I think that there's something like that goes on in circling, like that kind of that sense of that I, that 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 learning how to attune to and see beauty, right? To see the good, to come into an attuned relationship with that, and that being that experience of seeing that being the ground for the experience I have of myself, right?
I mean, there's something, as we were using Martin Buber's language in the I-thou relationship, that I've always found very significant in the way, at least I hear Martin Buber, that he always emphasizes that in a real I-thou relationship always has a third element in it. There's always, in his theological Jewish language, God.
Yeah.
There is no real I-thou without God. Of course,
yeah.
If you want to translate this to a secular language, you also just can talk about the mystery.
Right, right.
And I found it very intriguing when you started the origin story of circling.
Yeah.
And telling this 12-hour-long conversation in the tent in Burning Man in the middle of a desert. I mean, this has archaic qualities, and not overstating the Burning Man, but at least the best parts of Burning Man are kind of a modern search for mystery, where people go to the desert to meet something. And it makes sense that I guess the power of being in the middle in the desert does something to a conversation that liberates this different way of opening.
Yeah.
And then when it's opened up, the moment when you just, the two of you point back to, then it can unfold its power already after this birthing moment in this. Because the mystery got seen in that, and that having seen it develops its own capacity to live, but it is always related to something that has this. I hope I'm not overstretching the high qualities of tent and desert and Burning Man, but I think things like that do something. They do something and they create something, and they create something that maybe is necessarily needed in our time, where we are completely embedded in transactionality in everything. And our friends kind of morph into YouTube, into Facebook friends, where basically the clickability and the click amount become the measurements of relationship, which is all nothing but transactional. And it seems that maybe there's something of this other that opened up there that made it so powerful, because something caught fire there. Otherwise, it would not have spread.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Totally. And that mystery, that kind of ontological mystery, I think is I appreciate the way that you brought that back and brought that into your own language about what happened, because it's like, yeah, you're right. There is this this opening up, right, of, if you call it God, you can call it the mystery, whatever word you use, it's going to be, there's something ineffable about it, yet so like when you touch in on it, it's like, really, I can't imagine touching in on that and that not profoundly like changing everything, in a big big way. And so cultivating that, circling is in some sense has been self-organizing it now, we, over the years, and this took a long time, this in itself was quite a process of discovering, right, and articulating the underlying, you could say, logos of circling, right? Because for the first number of years, the way that we practiced it, we did it, but we didn't really know how we did it, right? And so it made it really difficult to teach. And so the early years, right? I remember like the early years, it was so experimental, right? Because we didn't know how, Jerry and I really didn't know how we did what we did. And we couldn't quite admit that to ourselves at the time. Our relationship with that, it was like, we were quite human to say the least about that. So what we would do is just immerse ourselves in just circling the hell out of everybody in our courses that we were training, right? And basically hope for the best. But now over time, though, I started to be able to recognize that there's patterns, right? There's patterns to circling, right? And that there's certain stages and facets. And once I started to see that, and then was able to start to put language to it, right? That's when for me, I was like, okay, I think now we can genuinely teach this. And that definitely has been my experience. Right. And so a lot of what we do at the Circling Institute is we have a year-long training program, and that go through what we call the 7 stages of circling, right? And each stage, right, emphasizes a particular kind of, you could say, quality of being, particular kind of, you could say, skill sets of listening and speaking, right? And so each weekend of that training is going deep into that particular facet or that particular stage of circling, right? And so in some sense, circling keeps revealing what it is to me. I keep discovering it more and more. And what I'm discovering about it is that there's a deep internal logic to it. There's a deep internal logic to it that like seeing it and discovering it is, I would have to say, is one of the most compelling and fascinating experiences of my life, and continues to be. Right? It's kind of like seeing how all of this stuff works and how it makes sense and how it fits into everything else, and that you can bring language to it, and that opens it up for somebody and they can kind of step into it and practice it and take it on. It's probably one of the most exhilarating, and continues to be one of the most exhilarating experiences I have of my life, is watching people kind of learn, develop, and transform through it,
Thank you so much for sharing this origin story of settling. It really opened up something for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah. My privilege. Truly.